On the morning of October 11, 2025, Hollywood stood still. Headlines that no one ever wanted to read spread like a shadow across every screen. Diane Keaton had passed away at the age of 79. The statement from her family was brief, restrained, and heartbreakingly simple. The family asked for privacy at this time. Behind those few words, the industry felt the weight of something enormous, the quiet ending of a woman who had shaped half a century of cinema. Soon after, major outlets, the New York Times, CNN, People, Variety all confirmed the same news. Reports cited pneumonia as the medical cause of death, a word so ordinary it felt almost cruel when attached to someone as extraordinary as Diane Keaton. A life so full of color reduced to a medical term, it was as if the world had run out of language grand enough to describe her departure. Colleagues and friends began to speak. Sarah Paulson called it a profoundly sad day, remembering Keaton as both a mentor and a friend. Bette Midler posted a black and white photo from the set of The First Wives Club, writing, "No one could ever imitate that messy, dazzling, lovable magic that was Diane." The tributes poured in like a gentle rain. Actors, directors, designers, all searching for the right words to fill the silence she left behind. Yet while Hollywood mourned, social media erupted. Rumors multiplied, whispers of secret phone calls, missing papers, mysterious men of power. In the space between fact and fantasy, speculation found oxygen. But perhaps the more respectful thing, the human thing, is to pause and look back at what's verified, tangible, and true. Because Diane Keaton's story does not need embellishment to be haunting. Her life was already a script filled with light and shadow, laughter and solitude, and her final months quiet, private, and far from the noise of red carpets spoke louder than any conspiracy ever could. Her last Instagram post, dated April 11, 2025, shows her smiling beside her golden retriever, Reggie. The caption reads, "Proof that our pets have great taste too." A simple line, a casual smile, but in hindsight, that image feels like a soft farewell. A woman content in her small joys, unbothered by fame, ready for silence. This is where we begin, not with speculation, but with truth and tenderness. We will remember Diane Keaton through her art, her voice, and the quiet rebellion that defined her. If the world insists on calling her death mysterious, then perhaps the only mystery worth keeping is how she managed to remain so completely herself in a city that asks everyone to be someone else. In the hours following the announcement, Hollywood's collective heartbeat slowed. Statements arrived one after another, each echoing a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. From Francis Ford Coppola to Woody Allen, from Goldie Hawn to Jack Nicholson, those who had shared screens, scripts, and decades with Diane Keaton tried to make sense of the impossible that she was gone. Her family spokesperson released the first official confirmation to the New York Times that afternoon. Diane passed peacefully at her home in Los Angeles, surrounded by her loved ones, due to complications from pneumonia. The phrasing was simple, stripped of emotion, as if designed to protect the privacy she had always valued. Yet that very simplicity felt like an epitaph, quiet, dignified, and deeply Diane. As tributes mounted, media outlets began retracing her final public months. It didn't take long to notice that she had gradually withdrawn from the spotlight. She had stopped attending public events, declined interviews, and left several film projects quietly on hold. For an artist who once described Instagram as her daily joy, the silence felt unnatural, as though the woman who had built a career on honesty had finally grown weary of being seen. Friends told People magazine that Diane had been content, peaceful, and very private in her last year. She spent most of her time at home, tending to Reggie, reading scripts she no longer felt pressured to accept, and walking through her sunlit garden in Brentwood. to those close to her. There was no trace of tragedy, only a quiet acceptance that she was entering a slower, gentler chapter. And then came October 11th. According to Los Angeles emergency records, a call was placed shortly after 6:40 a.m. reporting an unresponsive woman at Keaton's Brentwood residence. She was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where she was later pronounced dead. The news reached the press within hours. People, Variety, and CNN all confirmed the same details. 79 years old. Pneumonia. Peacefully at home. There were no signs of foul play. No dramatic final act, just an ending that arrived too soon. As word spread, flowers began appearing at the gate of her villa, white lilies, yellow roses, handwritten notes in shaky cursive. Neighbors described the scene as unbearably still. One woman, who had often seen Diane walking Reggie at dawn, left a single note taped to the gate. "You made ordinary life feel like art." By evening, the tributes had gone global, from London to Paris, Sydney to Tokyo. The film world spoke the same language of loss. The Guardian called her the quiet architect of a new kind of woman in cinema. Vanity Fair wrote, "She never chased glamour, she became it." Still, amid the mourning, a peculiar undertone lingered, the online hunger for mystery. Rumors about her final phone call began trending, with tabloids speculating connections that no credible outlet could confirm. Yet the family, through her son Duke Keaton, issued one last statement that seemed to settle the noise. "My mother's life was not a mystery. It was a masterpiece, complete, private, and exactly how she wanted it." And perhaps that was the truth everyone needed to hear. Diane Keaton didn't vanish into scandal or secrecy. She chose silence as her final act of authorship, a decision consistent with how she had lived, on her own terms, with grace, restraint, and defiance all at once. Her funeral, held days later in a private Los Angeles ceremony, was described by a close friend as a gathering of gratitude. There were no cameras, no reporters, just family, a few close friends, and a small string quartet playing "Seems Like Old Times," the theme from Annie Hall. In the end, the timeline of Diane Keaton's final days was not a riddle to solve, but a poem to read slowly, a life that ended as it was lived, quietly revolutionary. To understand the magnitude of Diane Keaton's departure, one must first understand what she stood for, not just as an actress, but as a symbol. For over 50 years, she was Hollywood's great contradiction, elegant yet awkward, shy yet bold, private yet utterly magnetic. In a city obsessed with perfection, she built her fame out of imperfection, out of quirks, doubts, and that unpolished authenticity that made her seem not like a goddess, but like one of us. Her career began modestly, on Broadway, before Francis Ford Coppola chose her to play Kay Adams in The Godfather, 1972. It was a decision that puzzled many. She was not the conventional beauty of her time, not voluptuous, not glamorous, not the studio archetype. Yet when she appeared on screen, there was something haunting about her fragility. In the closing shot of The Godfather, as the door slowly shuts between Kay and Michael Corleone, Diane's eyes spoke of innocence broken, a woman realizing too late that love, in that world, was never safe. That look, half love and half loss, became immortal. She returned in The Godfather Part 2, 1974, even stronger, colder, and infinitely more complex. Audiences no longer saw her as a victim, but as a woman who dared to confront power. And then came Annie Hall, 1977. It wasn't just a film, it was a revolution. In Annie Hall, Keaton transformed neurosis into poetry. She wore men's vests, oversized khaki pants, and loose-ties clothing she brought from her own wardrobe. Suddenly, women everywhere were copying the look. The Annie Hall style wasn't just fashion, it was philosophy, a declaration that women didn't need to dress for approval. They could dress for freedom. Her performance earned her an Academy Award for Best Actress, and with it, a permanent place in cultural history. She had given voice to a generation of women who were intelligent, imperfect, funny, and unafraid to be complicated. Throughout the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, Diane refused to fade as so many actresses did when Hollywood deemed them too old. She proved that aging was not an exit, it was an evolution. Films like Baby Boom, 1987, The First Wives Club, 1996, and Marvin's Room, 1996, portrayed women who were strong, wounded, funny, and real. In Something's Gotta Give, 2003, opposite Jack Nicholson, she played a middle-aged playwright rediscovering love and self-worth. Her vulnerability in that role, crying, laughing, typing furiously in her robe, felt almost autobiographical. The film earned her yet another Oscar nomination and reintroduced her to a new generation. But Diane Keaton's influence stretched far beyond acting. She became a director, producer, photographer, designer, and writer. Her 2011 memoir then again paid tribute to her mother, a woman whose diaries inspired Diane's own lifelong introspection. In, let's just say it wasn't pretty, 2014, she wrote candidly about aging and the absurd pressure on women to remain flawless. She confessed her fears of loneliness, of irrelevance, of fading beauty, and turned them into art. That was Diane's genius, to transform insecurity into strength, and strength into tenderness. Her love of architecture was another reflection of her character, meticulous, creative, restless. She restored old Los Angeles homes, capturing their rebirth in her book, The House That Pinterest Built, 2017. That home in Brentwood with white brick walls, Spanish tiles, and sunlight spilling across the floor was her sanctuary. She once said in an interview, "I build homes like I build characters from the inside out." And perhaps that's why the house she left behind felt like more than property. It was a map of her soul. Diane Keaton's greatest role, however, was the one she played off-screen as a woman who refused to let the world define her worth. She never married. She adopted her 2 children, Dexter and Duke, in her 50s. She rejected plastic surgery, refused to hide her wrinkles, and made aging look not just acceptable, but beautiful. When asked if she regretted not marrying, she smiled and said, "No, I had love, just not the kind people expect." She was Hollywood's last great original, an actress who didn't chase relevance because she was relevance. In her, the industry saw a mirror of brilliance, of fear, of freedom. And that, perhaps, is why her death resonated so deeply. Because Diane Keaton wasn't simply lost, she was needed. Behind every image of Diane Keaton, the crisp suits, the eccentric hats, the laugh that could fill a room, there lived a quieter, more intricate soul. To truly understand her is to step beyond the spotlight, into the stillness where she kept her truest self. For all her fame, Diane remained profoundly private, almost secretive about the mechanics of her heart. In interviews, she often spoke not of triumphs but of fears, of how easily admiration can turn to loneliness, and how even success can feel like a disguise. "People think confidence is the absence of fear," she once said. "But I live with fear every day. The trick is to make it part of your costume." That line alone could have been written by one of her characters, self-aware, ironic, and yet heartbreakingly sincere. She was known to keep journals, thousands of pages chronicling her life, not glamorous parties or awards, but small thoughts about beauty, time, and memory. Her children described her as someone who would stop mid-conversation to admire the way afternoon light touched the kitchen table. She found poetry in the ordinary, grace in imperfection. That was Diane's quiet rebellion against the Hollywood machine to be human in a place that worships performance. Her solitude was not emptiness, but discipline. She often told younger actresses, "Learn to love being alone. That's where you'll find your truth." This philosophy shaped every choice she made, her decision to stay unmarried, to adopt children as a single mother, to keep working long after others slowed down. Diane Keaton never surrendered to expectation. She negotiated with it on her own terms. Friends recalled that her house in Brentwood was almost monastic, walls painted in shades of white, shelves lined with photography books, sketches, and old film reels. Each object had meaning. Each corner felt curated not for display, but for peace. On quiet evenings, she would play old records, Ella Fitzgerald, Leonard Cohen, while Reggie slept by her feet. One friend said, "Diane didn't need noise. Her mind was enough company." She spoke often about aging not as decline, but as revelation. "There's a freedom in knowing the world no longer expects you to be perfect," she wrote. In her 60s, she began to see beauty as rebellion, the refusal to erase, the courage to stay visible. Where others feared wrinkles, she saw stories. Where others chased youth, she built wisdom. And yet, there was always an undertone of melancholy, not sadness, but awareness. Diane knew that every spotlight eventually fades. Every applause quiets. She often described fame as a costume that outlives the actor. In one of her last interviews, when asked what she feared most, she paused for a long moment before answering softly, "Forgetting who I was before they told me who to be." Perhaps that's why she withdrew from public view in her final months. It wasn't secrecy, it was self-protection. A choice to return to stillness, to the life she built before fame, before scripts, before cameras. Those who knew her best say she never stopped creating, even in her later years. She spent mornings photographing the shadows cast by trees on her patio walls. To her, light was both subject and metaphor, elusive, tender, fleeting. When she passed, she left not just films, books, or art behind, but a way of being, honest, imperfect, defiant in its gentleness. Diane Keaton reminded the world that solitude isn't loneliness, it's clarity. And that authenticity, however quiet, is the loudest form of courage. When news of Diane Keaton's passing rippled through Hollywood, it was not merely the loss of an actress, it felt like the vanishing of a compass. She had always been a reference point, a proof that one could thrive without surrendering. But in the days that followed October 11th, something uncanny happened. The silence became louder than the tributes. Every network reported the same minimalist statement: no long interviews, no emotional press conferences, no public memorial. The industry that once dissected every dress she wore now found itself speechless. It was as if Hollywood, for once, respected her boundaries or perhaps feared what her departure revealed about itself. In the absence of details, the human mind does what it always does. It fills the void. Tabloids speculated. Anonymous sources whispered of secret phone calls, lost manuscripts, and powerful men. The algorithms turned grief into entertainment, sorrow into spectacle. But the truth is far simpler and infinitely more human. Diane Keaton did not die in mystery. She died on her own terms, after a life spent negotiating with the noise of fame. Her son, Duke Keaton, released a final statement that cut through the fog. "My mother wasn't interested in drama. She was interested in art, in quiet, and in living truthfully. She didn't leave us a mystery, she left us a legacy. That word legacy carried more truth than any headline. Because while the world searched for explanations, the real story was hidden in plain sight in her essays about aging, her love for light and architecture, her rejection of perfection. Diane had been preparing for silence all along, sculpting a life that could stand without applause. Still, within Hollywood's glass towers, her death sparked reflection. In private conversations, younger actresses spoke about her as a North Star, someone who made it possible to age without apology. Studios that once overlooked women past 50 began re-examining their scripts. Even fashion houses revived the Annie Hall silhouette, the loose vest, the unbuttoned shirt, the masculine confidence softened by grace, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder that individuality never goes out of style. Meanwhile, at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, a small tribute appeared 2 weeks later, a quiet exhibit titled Diane Keaton, A Life in Light. It featured not gowns or trophies, but photographs she had taken herself, sunlit corners, empty chairs, trees bending in California wind. Beneath one image was her handwritten note, "Light is how I pray." Visitors described the exhibit as disarming. There were no grand narratives, no scandals, just stillness. A fitting farewell for a woman who had mastered the art of restraint. And yet, as months passed, something deeper settled in. Her absence began to feel like a mirror. Without Diane, Hollywood seemed to confront its own fragility, its obsession with youth, its fear of authenticity, its addiction to noise. She had been, in her own quiet way, its conscience. And now that conscience was gone. Still, the truth that remains is this: Diane Keaton's greatest performance was not on screen. It was the life she composed off it, a long, slow rebellion against a system built on illusion. Her death, free of spectacle, was her final act of authorship. And so, while the world keeps searching for secrets, perhaps the only one worth uncovering is the lesson she left behind. That silence, when chosen, is the purest form of freedom. When the lights of Hollywood dimmed for Diane Keaton, something ineffable lingered, a presence, not a void. In her passing, she seemed to offer one last lesson, the same one she had spent her life quietly teaching, that authenticity is not an act, but an act of courage. Diane Keaton was never the kind of woman who lived by the script others handed her. In a world that demanded glamour, she chose humor. In an industry obsessed with perfection, she chose vulnerability. In a city that treats aging as disappearance, she chose to remain visible wrinkles, laughter lines, eccentric hats and all. She stood not against the system, but outside of it, proving that grace could exist without submission. Her love life, too, was an exercise in honesty. She once said, "I've loved deeply, but I've never wanted to belong to anyone." To the tabloids that seemed lonely, to her, it was liberation. She had affairs that burned like chapters with Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, Al Pacino, but in the end, she chose a quieter kind of love for her children, her art, her solitude. She was not the damsel of romance, but its editor cutting what didn't fit, keeping what mattered. Through every decade, Diane Keaton reminded us that to be loved and to be known are not the same thing. Fame can make you visible, but it cannot make you seen. That difference, that chasm between public light and private truth, was where she built her art. Her roles were always reflections of this paradox. Kay Adams, standing behind a man who would never let her in. Annie Hall, who made love sound like philosophy. Erica Berry in Some Things Gotta Give, who turned heartbreak into laughter. Each character was a different echo of herself, curious, flawed, radiant in her refusal to be reduced. And perhaps that's why her death resonates so deeply. Because Diane Keaton was more than an actress. She was a mirror for anyone who has ever feared being too much or not enough. She made awkwardness elegant, loneliness lyrical, and imperfection magnetic. In her 2014 memoir, she wrote, "The hardest thing in life is to keep becoming yourself." That sentence now feels prophetic. Her farewell, disguised as advice. Hollywood will continue, as it always does, to chase the next face, the next miracle, the next story. But somewhere in the quiet corridors of memory, Diane Keaton will remain not as a ghost, but as a voice whispering to anyone brave enough to listen. You don't have to shine. You just have to be real. That is the truth she left us. That is the inheritance of her silence. And as the curtain falls, not with applause, but with gratitude, the camera fades to black on a woman who never pretended to be anything other than human. Diane Keaton didn't simply play life. She lived it honestly, fiercely, imperfectly. And that is her greatest masterpiece.